The Nigerian Civil War, better known as the Biafran War, remains one of the deadliest conflicts ever fought on African soil. From July 6, 1967 to January 15, 1970, Nigeria was consumed by a brutal three-year struggle. Over 100,000 soldiers perished and at least 2 million civilians, mostly from starvation, lost their lives. At the center of this tragedy stood General Yakubu Gowon, leader of the Nigerian government, determined to keep the nation united, and Colonel Chuckwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, the military governor of the eastern region, who declared the secession of the Republic of Biafra. To truly understand how this catastrophic war erupted, we must look back, far before 1967, into the deep divisions that shaped Nigeria from its very birth. When Nigeria gained independence from Britain in 1960, the nation inherited far more than just a flag and anthem. It inherited fault lines, ethnic, cultural, religious, that would eventually erupt into open conflict. Nigeria's three largest ethnic groups, the Igbo in the southeast, the Hausa Fulani in the north, and the Yoruba in the southwest, each carried centuries of distinct traditions and political structures. The Igbo, making up the majority in the east, had long lived in decentralized societies, where leadership was shared among councils of elders, title holders, and respected community members. Ambition, wealth through hard work, and problem-solving earned a man prestige. This culture of individual drive and enterprise would later propel many Igbo into business and industry across Nigeria. The Hausa Fulani, predominantly Muslim and concentrated in the north, lived under emirates where political authority and religion were inseparable. Emirs and sultans ruled as both temporal and spiritual leaders, and society valued obedience and stability over individual ambition. While this fostered order, it also meant the North was less receptive to Western education, leaving literacy rates at independence drastically lower than those of the South. The Yoruba stood somewhere in between, with a mix of Christianity, Islam, and traditional religion. They built kingdoms led by Obas, monarchs who ruled with the guidance of chiefs and priests. Yoruba society, while hierarchical, valued scholarship and artistic achievement, producing many of Nigeria's most renowned intellectuals and cultural icons. Though these differences did not automatically breed hatred, the seeds of rivalry were firmly planted, especially between the northern Hausa Fulani and the more urbanized southern groups. In 1914, British Governor Lord Frederick Lugard merged the northern and southern protectorates into one entity, Nigeria. For many Yoruba and Igbo historians, this amalgamation was less about unity and more about control. By linking the wealthier, better educated South with the more pliant North, Britain found it easier to rule through northern elites who were loyal and less rebellious. Northern leaders were frequently placed in powerful colonial positions, while southern Nigerians, despite higher levels of Western education, were largely limited to subordinate roles. When independence loomed, it was southern politicians, Yoruba and Igbo, who pressed hardest for freedom. Some northern elites, fearing they would lose their privileged positions, were hesitant. Their eventual support came with conditions: that Nigeria's political system preserve the North's dominance. And so, at independence, Nigeria was divided into three large regions: North, East, and West, with the North disproportionately larger. The system was democratic in form, but in practice, politics was driven less by ideology than by ethnicity. The North's size gave its party, the Northern People's Congress, a built-in advantage, while the Igbo-aligned NCNC and the Yoruba-based Action Group filled the opposition. Nigeria had been born, but unity was fragile. As Igbo traders, professionals, and entrepreneurs migrated across the country in search of opportunity, resentment simmered. In many northern towns, their success sparked suspicion and hostility. By the mid-1960s, Nigeria's young democracy was plagued by corruption, election rigging, and growing discontent. On January 15, 1966, a group of army officers, most of them Igbo, staged a coup. Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa, Northern Premier Ahmadu Bello, and Western Premier Samuel Akintola were assassinated. Though President Nnamdi Azikiwe, an Igbo, was abroad and unharmed, suspicion spread rapidly. Major General Johnson Agri Ironsi, also Igbo, assumed power. In the eyes of many Northerners, the coup was seen not as a national correction, but as an Igbo conspiracy. 6 months later, Northern officers struck back. In July 1966, Ironsi was killed in a counter-coup, and Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, governor of the Eastern region, demanded justice. He called for greater autonomy, control of regional resources, and a restructured army that would end Northern dominance. In January 1967, Gowon and Ojukwu met in Aburi, Ghana. The announcement was met with celebration in the East. People believed at last they had reclaimed their sovereignty. But Lagos responded with war. Gowon vowed to keep Nigeria united by force. The Nigerian military was larger, better equipped, and supported by Britain and the Soviet Union. Biafra had no navy, no air force, and severe shortages of arms. Yet Ojukwu was confident. He believed determination and resilience would compensate for lack of firepower. Initial Nigerian offensives reclaimed key cities quickly, but to the surprise of many, Biafran forces, many of them young boys and hastily trained volunteers, held their ground. As months turned into years, the war settled into a brutal stalemate. Unable to force Biafra's surrender through military might, the Nigerian government imposed a total blockade by land, air, and sea. Food, medicine, and supplies could no longer enter. Tin disappeared from diets almost overnight. Stockfish imports stopped. Fishing was impossible, and meat became a luxury. Children wasted away with swollen bellies, their frail bodies broadcast on television screens across the world. It is estimated that 2 million civilians, mostly children, died from hunger and disease. The blockade was justified by Nigeria's leaders as a quick way to end the war. They believed Ojukwu, faced with such suffering, would surrender. Instead, he urged his people to endure, insisting victory was near. While Britain backed Nigeria, France quietly supported Biafra. French leaders described the conflict as a noble cause, but economic interests lay beneath the rhetoric. French oil companies sought a stake in Nigeria's reserves, and Biafra offered them opportunity. Through covert channels, France supplied Biafra with weapons, mercenaries, and humanitarian aid. Though only a handful of countries officially recognized Biafra, Tanzania, Gabon, Ivory Coast, Zambia, and Haiti, the French connection prolonged the war. Images of starving children flooded Western media. Protests erupted in London, New York, and beyond. Some blamed Ojukwu for refusing to surrender, accusing him of sacrificing his people for pride. Others condemned Gowon's government for waging what they saw as genocide. International humanitarian organizations mounted unprecedented relief efforts, flying in food under the cover of night. Yet, the suffering only deepened. One American student, in despair at the world's inaction, set himself on fire outside the United Nations in 1969. His final protest, a symbol of global frustration. By late 1969, Nigeria intensified its campaign. With fresh arms from its allies, the Federal Army launched Operation Tailwind, led by Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo. For weeks, they battered Biafra's defenses. One by one, key strongholds fell. In January 1970, as Gowon proclaimed a policy of no victor, no vanquished. He spoke of reconciliation, reconstruction, and reintegration. But reality told a harsher story. Igbo families who had lost everything returned to find their savings wiped out. Regardless of what was in their bank accounts before the war, each was given only £20. Many saw this as a deliberate attempt to cripple Igbo recovery. At the same time, the government's indigenization policies enriched elites in the north and southwest, cementing economic inequalities that remain visible today. Accusations of abuse by federal troops, rape, looting, mistreatment of civilians, further scarred survivors. Healing proved slow and incomplete. 50 years later, the memory of Biafra has not faded. Movements like the indigenous people of Biafra, led by Nnamdi Kanu, have reignited calls for independence. In the Niger Delta, militants demand control of oil wealth. In the Yoruba Southwest, some campaign for an Oduduwa Republic. All reflect a deeper truth. Nigeria's union, forged by colonial hands, remains fragile. The same grievances of marginalization, inequality, and centralization of power persist. As long as these wounds remain unhealed, the ghost of Biafra will continue to haunt Nigeria's future. When Lord Lugard merged North and South in 1914, he could not have foreseen the rivers of blood that would follow. More than a century later, Nigerians still wrestle with the legacy of that union. The question remains, can a nation so vast, so diverse, and so scarred by history truly become one? Or will the cycle of division, conflict, and distrust continue? Only time will tell.